Today we're going to be talking about port of entry violations. We've got Shannon McMurtry with us from USDA FSIS Office of International Coordination. We're going to start with her this morning and have her talk a little bit about kind of the FSIS policy and regulations around when an exporter has a port of entry violation, whether that's product that's held up in country for any number of reasons, kind of how the agency handles that and some of their policies surrounding that. And then I'll kind of follow up at the end here talking about where USMEF falls into that and kind of how we can assist you guys as our members. Just a couple housekeeping notes real quick. This presentation will be recorded, and after the webinar today, we will send out a link to all of the registered attendees of where they can find a copy of that recording. And we will also send around a copy of the slides. Additionally, the recording will be posted to the USMEF website, and you can have access to it if you're a USMEF member there. At any time during the presentation today, please feel free to submit any questions. We will have some time at the end of this for a Q&A session. And you can submit those questions via the Q&A function or through the chat function down at the bottom of your screen. So with that, I will go ahead and turn the reins over here to Shannon McMurtry. Like I said, she's with the USDA Office of International Coordination. Very steeped in these issues. I've worked a lot with her over the years on some of these issues and can provide some good context into kind of the FSIS regulatory side of this. So with that, Shannon, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Travis, and welcome everybody to today's presentation. I think some of you may have had a preliminary glimpse at this during one of the other regional webinars that we did and I presented at. But for those of you, again, that don't know me, my name is Shannon McMurtry. I'm with the FSIS Office of International Coordination. I do work closely with Travis and with you all in industry, as well as our other industry partners and the Foreign Ag Service, coordinating any number of international issues for the agency in the food safety space. And certainly we get very involved in issues when there are problems with shipments getting stuck or trying to resolve issues relative to export requirements. But what we wanted to focus on today was, I think, trying to maybe peel back the curtain a little bit and give you a bit of clarity on sort of what the FSIS process is and procedures when we get notifications from foreign countries of port of entry violations. So hopefully as we go through the slides today, I can share a little bit of insight and maybe dispel some of the mysteries of what the FSIS process is and why it's important to you and to us as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Shannon. So first off, just to kick things off, I'm not telling you anything that you all don't know, very well in your own right, but FSIS is the agency that certifies for export meat, poultry, and egg products around the world. We certify products that are exported through any number of means, container ships, air freight, trucks, rail cars. We sort of do it all. It doesn't necessarily matter the means by which the product is transported out of the United States, but certainly we are responsible for the certification of all of those means of transport for meat and poultry and egg products. And again, a little bit dated data, you all have more, sort of current information, but again, it's just a glimpse into, sort of some of the key markets that we export product to around the world. You all are certainly more familiar as I am with the fact that, some of our biggest export markets are our closest neighbors, Mexico and Canada. There's movement of product back and forth. And then certainly a lot of the Asian markets are very robust locations. And one reason this graphic is sort of important is because I think this lays the foundation for, what we're going to talk about here and the idea of how do we treat or what do we do when we get a port of entry violation. Certainly Canada and Mexico, I would say, if we were to sit down and count the notifications we get for port of entry violations, most of them are coming from Mexico and Canada. Again, perhaps not surprising because those are the biggest markets that we export to. And then additionally, some of our Asian markets, Taiwan, Japan, Hong Kong, Korea, I would say are probably, and then also include in this list, maybe China, are some of the other markets where I think we have the most sort of robust engagement when it comes to notifications of port of entry violations relative to product that's certified for export that we sort of have to deal with. So again, this is just sort of trying to set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. So when FSIS, we do get port of entry violation notifications from a lot of foreign countries, and really, I guess, sort of putting the shoe on the other foot. We certainly do import inspection or re-inspection of product coming in here to the United States. And so, even for us as a regulator, we're sensitive to why countries do import re-inspection and what they're looking for, and what the objective is. And largely we share that goal of making sure that the product that is imported into our country or that another country would import does meet their requirements and does not pose a public health or food safety risk to their population. So we share that commonality. Also, like FSIS, countries that we've engaged with, those that I mentioned on the previous slide, generally have a process to officially notify, and we refer to it as the Central Competent Authority, the CCA, or the counterpart to FSIS has a process whereby they notify us when there's a port of entry violation. And we'll get into on the next slide, sort of what we mean or definitions of what are the typical port of entry violations. But suffice it to say that these are official communications we receive or we look to receive from a foreign country when product doesn't meet their regulatory requirements at import. And what they generally are looking for, and we'll again go through this as we go through the slides, but they're looking to communicate that there's been a violation, right? They want us as the regulatory and the certifying authority to be aware that product didn't meet their standards. One, it's to our benefit as a regulator to make sure that we're aware and we can look around and make sure that we correct whatever issues are going on, particularly if maybe they're in the labeling or in the certification phase of statements or something of that nature. But additionally, if somehow product, doesn't meet their standards and poses a risk because of pathogen detections, that's something we actually want to know about too, relative to any other product that might be in commerce on the domestic side. So we're really looking to get that information from them, take action to look into whatever the problem was, ensure future exports do not present the same hazard, and then as an additional touch point, relate that back to any domestic product that might also pose the same hazard to our United States general population. So again, we're looking to kind of help you maybe understand the FSIS process of how we go about investigating port of entry violations, what we're looking for in terms of verifying corrective actions, and then give you some sense of the official response process that we do to communicate back to the foreign country and close out these cases. So for those of you that may not be familiar, the roadmap for how we do this is captured in FSIS Directive 9040.5. That's publicly available on our webpage. I fully recognize that our webpage has had an overhaul. So when I send the slides to Travis and he relays that back out, we'll be also sure to give you the link so that you can easily access the directive. It's a quick, short directive. And again, this presentation will sort of walk you through the high points, but it may be something I would suggest you may all, if you haven't already, you may want to bookmark or print off and keep at the ready just for situational awareness. So with regard to examples of port of entry violations, again, it's sort of a broad term that we use, and the kinds of things that we capture when we speak of port of entry violations, and I mean this on the import side as well as on the export side, generally encompass a variety of things. And there's these rough categories. Perhaps top of the list and most obvious is microbiological contamination or pathogen detection. Certainly, the big 4 or 5, Salmonella, E. coli, LM, Campylobacter, the STECs are probably top of the list. And those are the most common kinds of notifications that we get from foreign countries. Second, and perhaps again, sort of obvious, are residues that exceed MRLs. Vet drugs in particular, occasionally we get detections for pesticides, but again, I think vet drugs are the more common of the residue detections. And recent examples include ractopamine, some SEM, and occasionally we get some others. Adulteration or presence of foreign material, again, anything that's isn't supposed to be there that might pose a situation that could affect public health is captured there. Misbranding, certainly inaccurate or non-compliant labeling, undeclared allergens, would be another set of categories. Off condition or otherwise unfit. Sometimes we get products, and I would say this happens predominantly. I think Mexico is the biggest area where we've had this issue arise, is off condition product that is exported to Mexico, particularly in the summer. I think we see a little bit of a spike. Trucks go down, they wait at the border. Some of them turn off their reefers. And then the next thing you know is, we've got an off condition situation. So again, off condition, I think, is most prevalent, or the most notifications we get seem to be south of the border. We also note that we get some export certification discrepancies. I think a lot of these sometimes are rectified actually through replacement certificates. So I guess I would say on this category, maybe we don't see so many of these as a port of entry violation that we have to respond to, but these result more in stuck shipment issues that we have to resolve and work through. So that's probably a presentation for another day. But do note, on occasion, we get product refused entry because of export certification issues. And then lastly is ineligible products. Occasionally product is tested and there's a species detected that's not supposed to be there and that is not eligible. So we'll occasionally get those kinds of situations, and we're asked to investigate those kinds of matters and provide a reply how those errors have occurred. So in general, when we get a port of entry notification, and again, much of what I'm going to say here works in reverse, for imported product into the United States. But in general, we receive all the port of entry violation notifications we get in an official written format, an official letter from the foreign government. And usually those letters or those communications will provide a time frame. Will provide a time frame for investigation and response. In the case of FSIS, we request responses within 30 days. Canada, for instance, provides 45 days. Some of the other countries are a bit more flexible, as long as we're keeping them up to speed on the fact that we're moving forward with a response. And some, are a bit open-ended about it, but we'll periodically check in. A typical notification explains the nature of the violation and may also cite the legal basis. So typically we will get countries that will say, we've detected a violation of our MRLs, here's the legal level that's allowed, and here's where we draw the authority from to refer to this as a violation of our requirements. They'll typically give us a copy of the export certificate, and quite frankly, if they don't, then we ask for it, because that's the only way we sort of have to trace back the product and perform an investigation and provide a response. Occasionally, they'll also include pictures of the product or the label, particularly in a situation where it's off condition. These things might be helpful. Also, lab results. Sometimes we have to request those additional pieces. The official communications that we get generally come through our FAS post. To my office, the Office of International Coordination. And then from there, we coordinate the response, the dissemination of the notification out to other parts of the agency for their assistance in investigating and developing the response. So we relay them out to our policy office, which is home to the export staff. And then they then sort of take the baton and work directly with our Office of Field Operations in the district. And the FLS, or the implant personnel, who are the ones that actually then communicate with establishment personnel regarding these kinds of notifications and carrying out the investigation and the corrective actions. I would note that there are occasions, you guys are pretty plugged in, you have good relationships with your importers. So there are occasions where we find, frankly, I've had a few occasions where Travis will call me before, I've heard about it through my regulatory and FAS channels. So there are occasions where your importers, and because of your good relations, you may hear about it before FSIS knows. And, we always appreciate those heads up, when you're able and willing to share those, to link it up with anything that might be coming down the pike officially from the country. So kind of digging deeper into the process for the investigation. As I noted, they come to my office and then we sort of work with our policy and our district offices. We share the information that we've received from the foreign country. So typically we'll share the letter. Certainly we share all the documents that we get. Again, the export certificate that helps us identify the exporting establishment name and number, where the product was produced. Those are all clues that facilitate the investigation. We share any laboratory information we got about the violation and what the levels, for instance, of a residue were that were detected. Any identifying information about the particular lot or the particular shipment, such as the certificate and serial numbers, or container and seal numbers that help relate back to the export certificate. And then also any information that we've gotten either in writing or perhaps from our FAS personnel about the actions that the importing country has taken as a result of the violation with regard to the product or the establishment, or in some cases we find they even take action against the importers, which is a whole other discussion, but is a bit unfortunate because sometimes these things are out of their control. As some of you may or may not know, rejected product may, emphasis on may, be returned to the United States. There is a process and that's publicly available on our webpage. And again, probably another presentation for another day, but there is a process by which product can be returned to the United States, particularly if it's a question about MRLs and it's something that's in compliance with our MRLs, but maybe a different country has a different stricter tolerance. Those may be returned to be put into US commerce. Also, there are some occasions where a replacement cert may be issued or new labels applied. So again, going back to the earlier slide, depending on the nature of the issue, there may be avenues to rectify the issue and still get the product in, but we may still also find ourselves in a situation where while we can do that, we owe them an explanation for how the problem occurred and how we're going to prevent it from occurring in the future. And lastly, I guess, or not necessarily lastly, but perhaps the worst case scenario is that a country may prohibit exports from an establishment. And we see different ways that this is sort of termed. They may suspend the eligibility of certain products. They may suspend a particular plant, or they'll delist it. All of that is sort of the same net result, is that it impacts the ability for a plant or certain products to continue to be exported to a country until the port of entry violation is resolved. I would just add that our FSIS export library, and linked off of that for each country, is the eligible plant list, and it may be updated to reflect any delistments or the time frame with which product is ineligible to be shipped because a plant has been suspended while we work through a port of entry violation. And just, maybe for situational awareness, the last two bullets are just maybe some useful information, is that Korea is an example of a country where we do see automatic delistments for certain residue violations. SEM is sort of the most recent case in point. You have an SEM detection, doesn't really seem to matter at this moment, the who, what, where, when, why. That is an automatic delistment. And then we sort of have to claw our way back into the market, which in some cases we're still working through. Mexico and Canada have what I refer to as a 3 strikes approach. I think one of the frustrating things about that is it doesn't necessarily matter that there are 3 strikes of the same type, which would sort of indicate maybe a more systemic and food safety type of hazard. It's just any 3 strikes. So, for example, you can have an off condition, you can have a residue, and you can have a pathogen. you have those three things, within 60 days, they're not all necessarily indicators of the same kinds of problems or trends or public health issues. 3 strikes, you're out until we can address those issues, and the foreign country can agree and be comfortable with the corrective actions we've applied. So again, just something to kind of keep in mind with a couple of our key markets when it comes to port of entry violations. So continuing further on the kinds of port of entries, we see and what sort of the steps are, there are cases, and again, this is probably most applicable to some of our Asian markets, is if the port of entry violation is the result of a failure to conform to an AMS, QSA, EV, or PVP program. We may have to partner with AMS. I guess an example of this would be, somehow if we've had SRMs detected, for instance, in beef products where these kinds of programs might come into play, we potentially would have to partner with them to facilitate a fuller investigation, for them to weigh in on their pieces relative to those programs and how those played into the violation and what action has been taken corrective relative to those kinds of programs. So again, just an example of where these can get a little bit more complicated, in terms of reaching across more than just sort of FSIS. Also wanted to note that we certainly believe that the importing country, if they're applying a new requirement or, incorrectly applying something or taking liberties that somehow is inconsistent, with our understanding, our previous agreements, or even in some cases, what we believe is a WTO SPS provision, we may seek to open a dialogue on the technical side and explore the issues that are associated with the violation and coordinate with FAS and USTR on such issues. An example of this one, I guess, that I would highlight is we had a foreign country here some months back who had some salmonella positive detections on raw poultry. It sort of was a little bit of a head scratcher because we hadn't had any in a really long time. It was a raw poultry, which, we as a US position have repeatedly argued is sort of an unachievable standard. We did work our way through sort of the corrective actions. Things appear to be settled out, but we did go through the process of sort of, pondering, whether or not we needed to, and made statements in our response letters back, reminding them of sort of the science that sits behind such violations. So that's just kind of an example of sometimes, we need to do the immediate action to try to come to some sort of understanding and offer some corrective actions and feedback on a specific port of entry violation, but where it can also open the door to a bigger dialogue and a broader technical issue, which leads us then to a situation where we may be working on sort of 2 tracks, and again, that's sort of the immediate short-term discrete getting y'all's plants relisted and trying to provide information, while then on a broader scale, trying to work through the broader disputes, if you will, about the application of certain requirements and maybe the science that sits under those decisions as being valid or invalid. So again, it can sometimes be a complicated 2-track, but ultimately, I think our view is we need to try, to be cooperative in recognizing, that maybe we haven't met a foreign country's requirements, and acknowledge that and try to identify some ways that we can move forward, again, while the bigger issues are taken on. And again, we can talk more about that on the side, but that's a tricky bit of business. So and that's one reason we do encourage industry, to try to tackle those corrective actions, sort of for the short term, while we try to take up the broader issues, that would maybe impact other plants or preclude a longer standing absence from the market. So again, when the FSIS, when we get the request for a port of entry or the notifications, we do sort of funnel those out through OFO to the district office, and they typically then work with the inspector in charge or the frontline supervisor in the plant to inform the management. And typically that's done within 2 business days of them receiving it. And again, keeping in mind, we may get it a week or two after the detection. Sometimes they're delayed because of laboratory analysis. It takes some time for things to move out, but we do move them as quickly as we possibly can out to the field. We direct or request, I guess, depending on your perspective, the plant to kind of go through the process of identifying what the rationale might have been for the deficiency, and sort of do that introspection to see if we can identify what the problem was and come up with corrective actions. As you may or may not all know, this is also documented in a memorandum of information from our implant personnel to the establishment. And this is also where we're capturing the information about the investigation, any identification of a root cause for the violation, and then the corrective actions. And the reason the MOI becomes important, because that also is the mechanism by which that information is sort of officially captured by FSIS. And then that's used to help our personnel in the policy office and our export office craft the response. So understanding the facts of the case, what we found out, and what we're proposing to do to prevent a reoccurrence of the problem, that all gets wrapped up in sort of more layperson's terminology to inform the response to the foreign country. The deadlines that are set out in the directive are generally, we want those investigations and corrective actions within 10 to 15 days. Certainly, we've had cases where it's a bit more complicated and takes a bit more investigation, or it takes more time once you've identified the problem to verify the corrective actions. I think at the end of the day, the deadlines are mostly designed that there has to be something that happens within, a 2-week period of getting a notification, and that any sort of failure to do anything at all or to be dismissive, does put a plant at the risk of losing its eligibility. And I guess I would offer, maybe for a little bit of context why that might seem harsh, I think this is a rare situation where both industry and FSIS are sort of, we're sort of in this together, if you will. We've certified the product, we've certified the compliance of the plant. So we're a little bit on the hook as a regulator and as the party that interfaces with the foreign government to maintain some level of confidence in our system and our ability to oversee the plants. But then again, we need you all at the plant level to supply the information and to facilitate the process. So again, as long as there's something going on and we continue to make forward progress, we do recognize that some of these cases do take a little bit longer. But again, getting back to the earlier slide, where some countries want a response in 30 or 45 days, that's kind of why we've set out the timelines. That again, we can always go back to the countries and say, we're still investigating, we need more time. So again, it's just an open communication cooperative process that we need to maintain with the FSIS personnel at the plant level, with us at headquarters, so then we can communicate with the foreign countries and request additional time if needed. And I think I'm nearing the end here, but once we do have those corrective actions, and I've already sort of touched on that, then we'll package that up and we'll communicate that with the foreign country. And I do want to note, in some of those cases were identified on the previous slide, where maybe there's a bigger policy issue. For instance, the salmonella, we don't agree, that there's, a zero tolerance for raw poultry. We may then fold in sort of, more high-level FSIS regulatory language, that we've used in other cases to sort of say, okay, here's what the plant did. They did kind of go back. They looked at things that they might be able to do to shore up their food safety practices. But at the same time, we want to remind you that in our mind, this wasn't a food safety violation. And here's the reasons why, and here's how this fits within our requirements, and quite frankly, maybe how we understood it to fit with your requirements. So just keep in mind, sometimes there's additional context that we add, when we do sort of have those violations that have a bigger ramification to them. So we clear those letters, we send them out to the foreign government. In those cases where a plant is suspended or delisted, we oftentimes can't relist the establishment until we've provided that information and the country has noted satisfaction with the information we've provided. Again, Canada and Mexico are two prime examples of this. They're fairly quick. Sometimes we have to nudge them a little bit to be timely. you know, in the acceptance of our responses and get the plants relisted. But we do, you know, they are pretty good, and I think they've improved in recent years. Certainly, if we were to certify product without that confirmation, that could lead to potential rejections of product at import, cost you money, affects our credibility. It's just a headache all the way around. So we do like to avoid those situations, which then sort of leads us into kind of the Korea case, which is a bit of an exception to all the rules, but then at the same time, actually no different. Korea is an interesting case in the sense that we have under the 2008 beef protocol, and this is only applicable, I would say, under the beef side of things, is that there's a provision that essentially allows us to relist a beef establishment upon verification of corrective actions. We are at a bit of a dust up at the moment about whether or not, you know, that actually prevails. We on the USG side would say that it does. The Koreans, and in particular MFDS, would disagree and contend they weren't party to that agreement. It doesn't stand, and that their authority comes from the 2016 food safety law. So we are in a little bit of an interesting situation with Korea, and it is unique in the first place in that it has such a requirement, but now we also find ourselves in a unique situation of our couple port of entry violations as to whether or not, you know, and if we exercise that authority, whether or not they'll you know, reject the product, they'll take, you know, broader action against FSIS for certifying the product. So we're trying to carefully navigate it, but it is an interesting case in point because it is a little bit of an exception to the rule. Like I said, generally, FSIS would require, you know, confirmation out to a foreign country before they send us product. And most of the other countries do give that to us in return, and we update our lists so that there's no confusion whether or not product is eligible after an issue. So at this point in time, I opened it up to questions, but I think Travis would prefer maybe to hold them all till the end. I'll leave it to Travis, but otherwise, hope this was informative, and again, look forward to, you know, sort of some robust engagement if there's questions now or later. Either way, Travis, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Yeah, we will do questions here as I try and sort out the screen sharing. We will do questions at the end of my presentation. We should have probably about, hopefully 10 or 15 minutes to do that. And I see that we already have one question that came out on the Q&A. So please feel free to keep sending those in, again, via the Q&A or through the chat functions. So appreciate you, Shannon, for kind of giving that overview. I think that's helpful to kind of understand how FSIS approaches these issues, because I mean they're not extremely common, but you know, when an establishment does get in a situation where they've got a violation like this, I think it's helpful to know kind of all the steps that FSIS is going to take in order to rectify that and hopefully get your plant back to exporting as quickly as possible. But it's helpful to know kind of where the policy stands behind that. From my perspective, I'm going to talk about kind of how USMEF handles these port of entry issues, and how you can kind of work with us, leverage your membership of USMEF to work with myself, with Cheyenne McInduffer, in the export services group here to resolve issues as quickly as possible. I know, looking through the list of attendees who are on here, I've talked to Cheyenne and I have talked to many of you about issues of product that's not necessarily caused a delisting, but has been held up at the port of entry, had an issue through customs clearance, any number of problems there. And I think it'll help to give a little bit of perspective from our standpoint about how we work on those issues, not only with you as exporters, but also with the regulatory agencies within USDA to get those resolved. So Shannon talked about these, you know, these port of entry violations can take a lot of different shapes and forms, everything from export documentation to inspection issues. But then we also see a lot of in-market issues, whether that's sampling and testing that's being done at the local or municipality level, pulling product off of a retail shelf, doing an MRL test for that for veterinary drugs, et cetera. other type of violations, labeling compliance, issues with plan approvals or pre-registrations that's necessary, import permitting issues. All of those kind of fall into this general port of entry issues and violations category. And really, if you have problems with these on a specific shipment, reach out to USMEF, because that's a lot of what Cheyenne and I are here for, is to work with you as exporters to get those resolved as quickly and efficiently as possible. And when you reach out to USMEF, there's a lot of players that end up getting involved in these issues to try and resolve them. First and foremost, Cheyenne and I here in Denver, but there's a lot of issues that we hear from potentially your importer that reaches out to the USMEF foreign office that's in country where we see the issue. When an issue is brought to our attention, Cheyenne and I will get FAS, Foreign Agriculture Service in Washington, the Foreign Agriculture Service staff that's in country at the U.S. embassies in that country. FSIS will get Shannon's group, the Office of International Coordination, as well as the Export and Import Policy Division, or IEPDS, which they're really responsible for the export library and kind of interpretation of these export regulations that you're going to be held to. We work obviously with the exporter, with the importer, and even oftentimes we'll get the in-country government agencies involved, whether that's through government-to-government engagement with USDA. There's situations where our in-country staff have relationships with port of entry, customs inspectors, things of that nature. And so we'll get a lot of different folks involved when you guys have an issue, but ultimately, efficient communication is going to be the key to getting this resolved as quickly as possible. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but we know a lot of you have relationships with our foreign offices or with staff in FSIS or FAS. And so kind of, I think the gut instinct is to reach out to as many people as possible. But ultimately, Cheyenne and I are working with all of these different folks that are going to be in the chain and line of communication here. And so if we can communicate with them very efficiently and quickly, that's going to ultimately help us resolve your issues more quickly. When we look at issues that can result in the export process while the product is still in the United States, really the biggest issue we see there is when exporters and inspectors have different interpretations of the export regulations. And when you have an issue like that, we certainly encourage you to reach out to USMEF. Cheyenne and I work in the export library every single day. We've been working on these issues for years and have a pretty good understanding of what goes into the export library. And so if you've just got a question for your own interpretation, feel free to reach out to us. But if there's ultimately a disagreement between you and your inspector on, what a label should look like, or whether your product actually meets the requirements for that country or not, if there's ultimately a dispute where that inspector just simply won't sign the export certificate, then you need to follow kind of a very specific chain of command within FSIS in order to appeal that decision. So starting with the frontline supervisor of the inspector, if that doesn't work, you can go to the IIC. If that doesn't work, you can follow that up to the district office. And then ultimately, we can elevate that to the level of IEPDS in Washington, D.C. But one, USMEF does not have the authority to basically reach out to an inspector and tell them whether they're right or wrong from an interpretation standpoint. We've gotten that request before, and if that's what you're looking for, like I said, we can provide our thoughts to you as the exporter, but we really don't have the authority to reach out to an inspector at a plant and get them to change their mind there. Secondly, like I said, that chain of command is important, and really reaching out to FSIS in DC just for these discrepancies on interpretation should be the last case scenario. And typically when we try and get DC involved, the first question they're going to ask us is, have they gone to the FLS, to the IIC, to the district office? And if that hasn't happened yet, then DC generally is not going to weigh in on what that inspector's interpretation is. When it comes to export certificate issues, ultimately, as an exporter, you need to be very intimately knowledgeable of FSIS Directive 9000.1. That really outlines all of what FSIS can and cannot do from an export certification standpoint. Specifically, as it relates to replacement certificates, there's a section in the 9000.1 that outlines what scenarios an FSIS inspector can and cannot issue replacement certificates for, as well as what replacement certificate issues will or will not require product re-inspections. So there's a question in the Q&A, and this kind of goes to that, is that if the product is on the water and you realize that there's a certification issue that could potentially require a product re-inspection, if that product's already on the water, when you realize that that issue's there, really your only option at that point is to take that product, turn it around once it gets to the port of entry, send it back to the United States and get it re-inspected. And if you think that there is a potential issue whatsoever, do not put that product on the water. It absolutely decreases the level of flexibility for FSIS and what they can do for you and how that product can ultimately be handled. So it's important that you make sure that you check, double check, triple check, check a fourth time that your documentation is totally airtight before that product gets put on a vessel and sails. If that product is on the water or if it's landed at the port of entry, then USMEF generally is going to work directly with FSIS and FAS in DC, as well as the staff that would be in an embassy overseas to help resolve that issue. As soon as you realize there is an issue, reach out to Cheyenne or I as quickly as possible, because more often than not, we get reached out to when that product has been sitting at the port of entry for a few days. It's already racking up demurrage charges. It's now gone from an issue to a total crisis, and there's a lot of money on the line in those situations. And so if you can get to us as quickly as possible, it does take some time to work through these issues with USDA. It's not something that's going to happen in a matter of minutes or a matter of hours. It can sometimes take a few days to work through. So earlier notification on our part is going to help us just get through this more efficiently and more quickly. I alluded to this before, but if at all possible, try not to take kind of a shotgun approach to communications. There's a lot of you who have connections within FSIS or FAS, and you have staff that you've worked with and you know, but these are big agencies. There's a lot of staff within FSIS and FAS, and some may work on beef issues and some only work on pork issues. Some may only cover certain regions within Asia, while others cover certain regions in Central America or South America. And if you kind of make USMEF your first point of contact, we know all of those staff within FAS and FAS, who works on which portfolios and who is going to ultimately be the go-to person within either of those agencies to help you resolve these issues. And so we can kind of recommend that best path to success, who those folks are, and what agency or office is going to be best suited to respond to your issue. Shannon mentioned this before, but if you reach out to USMEF with an issue, helpful information for us is copies of all the export documents. If we go back to FSIS with an issue, that's their first question to us. Do you have a copy of the certificate so we can look up what the record of this product is? Also, where it is it on the water? Did it leave the West Coast 2 days ago? Has it been sitting at the port of entry for a week? What country is it destined to, and what the port of entry is that it's heading to within that country is helpful information. And then any communications on the issue, whether that's a conversation with your importer, whether you may have already reached out to the USMEF office in country or somebody within USDA. Any additional communications that we can get to kind of round out that picture and get all of the context necessary on these issues is going to help us move those issues forward. Finally, a couple of slides and then we'll wrap up and move on to the Q&A, but some things to consider. I mentioned this before, but don't put product on the water if the certificate, without the certificate being issued and signed. If that product is already in the water and you don't have a signature on that certificate, or there is just simply a certification issue, product already leaving the US drastically decreases FSIS's ability to assist with the issue. And frankly, more often than not, if that product has left the country and doesn't have a signature, FSIS and DC might not even be able to help at all. Another aspect of this is that at the port of entry, there's a lot of countries who will compare the date of the signature by the FSIS inspector with what the dates are on the bill of lading and the shipping documents or the shipping manifest. And so in some countries, that's just simply a red flag where they see, that the product had already sailed, but then the inspector signed it later. That's going to potentially create some questions. Some countries just flat won't allow shipments in if the signing of the certificate is dated after the sailing dates. So, make sure, again, I can't reiterate this enough, make sure that your certification is totally buttoned up before that product gets on the water, if at all possible. And again, on replacement certificates, there's very clear criteria in the 9000.1 directive that says when a replacement certificate can be issued without reinspection and when it can't. And FSIS does not offer any exceptions to that. So make sure you're very clear on what that says in the 9000.1. A second point is that FSIS is only going to certify to information that is in the export library. There's a lot of situations where product will be held up at a port of entry and your importer might come back and say, oh, you just have to add this remark into the 9060-5, but that remark is not listed anywhere in the export library. If the information that is being requested is not specifically detailed in the export library, the FSIS will not issue a replacement certificate. They will not vouch to that regulation or certify to that regulation unless it is specifically stated in the library. Kind of to add to that, there's a lot of times where, maybe an importer reaches out to you and says, oh no, there's this additional requirement. It's not in the libraries, but you have to meet it. And usually the request back to FSIS is, well, can you just add this into the library so I can clear my product? But FSIS will not add information into the export library unless it is present in an existing regulation within that country that is importing the product. And the only way FSIS will add that information to the export library is if it is through official government to government communications. This obviously cannot happen overnight. And FSIS, as Shannon kind of explained, they're going to engage bilaterally with that country to make sure that that they've got the regulations as up to date as possible. But just because your importer says that there's a regulation out there doesn't necessarily mean that there is, or it's something that warrants going into the export library. Which brings me to my next point, and I say this a little bit tongue in cheek, but in our general experience, we get a lot of calls that says, well, our importer's telling me this, our importer's telling me this. And more often than not, your importer is wrong. That's generally because they're the advice that you're getting from them, they're not clear on what the full extent of the USDA regulations are. They might not be aware of existing language in trade agreements or access protocols, like Shannon was talking about with the 2008 Korea beef protocol. All of that information, trade agreements, access protocols, existing regulations in the export library, all of that supersedes what your importer is going to tell you or what they might be aware of. And like I said, it usually takes the form of they want you to add information into the remarks section of the 9060-5, or that they are aware of some regulation that is either old or dated or just flat doesn't exist or hasn't been notified to FSIS. So it's great to get advice from your importer. It's good to have that awareness from our standpoint of what they're trying to tell you. But ultimately, if we're going to enlist USDA's help on this, they're only going to do it according to the regulations that are available to them. Finally, my last point here is that another request that we get a lot is when there's product hung up at the port of entry is, well, our importer just told us FSIS can write a letter and then that'll clear the product. FSIS can explain what's going on in a letter and the product will clear just fine. FSIS's policy is to not issue explanation letters. That doesn't mean that they don't ever do it, but it is in very, very rare circumstances and is always usually the last option to clear product. Definitely not the first. One of the requests that we hear very often is that the importer says, well, if you have a letter that's signed by the inspector who issued the certificate, then we can clear the product. Any letter that does come from FSIS has to come directly from Washington, D.C. That's typically going to be at a Shannon's group in OIC. So do not ask your local inspector to issue one. Don't ask your IIC or the district office. That letter is going to have to come from Washington. Additionally, it's got to be for an issue that's covered under FSIS policy or regulation. We've had requests about, issues with commercial seals on containers or commercial documentation or something that may have happened to the product after it left the United States. Something happened to that product while it was on a ship, and now they want FSIS to vouch that everything's fine with the product. If that product is out of the United States and something happens to it, FSIS isn't going to be able to vouch for what happened between the time it left the regulated facility to the time it landed at the port of entry. So that's going to be a situation where FSIS just can't do anything. And like I said, the letter is the last option. It's not the first. It won't be until USMEF, USDA has explored all of the options out there to resolve the issue that they'll even look at the option of writing a letter. And when they do write a letter, this isn't something where, Shannon can go sit at her desk, pound out a letter in 20 minutes, and then send it over to you that afternoon. It requires clearance within the agency, making sure that the language is fail-safe from an FSIS standpoint, and working that up through the chain of command there. So generally, if you are going to get a letter, it's going to take a little while for that ultimately to come through. So that is all I've got today. Just quickly before we move to Q&A, once again, if you've got questions, feel free to submit those through the chat and the Q&A functions. Our next training is still to be determined. We've got the USMEF Board of Directors meeting coming up in May, so we are probably going to push the next training till June, and don't have a topic for that yet, but just be on the lookout through our exporter update for more information and registration on that. After the webinar is over, you're going to be directed to a link for a survey. Please fill that out. It's very helpful for us to get feedback on the presentations and the content here and ideas for what we want to do on future trainings. So with that, Shannon, if you want to come back here, does look like we've got a couple questions that are coming in through the Q&A. So to start, so question here kind of goes back to product sailing before we've got that FSIS signature. So for exports, the health certificate should be signed before the vessel sails, but sometimes the inspector doesn't sign the product before it's loading, and the process of loading that product could take anywhere from 1 to 5 days. If the certificate is signed after sailing, it could be rejected at origin. So are the inspectors and the veterinarians who would sign these certificates aware of kind of this process?
So thanks for the question. And I guess, I think Travis touched on a couple of aspects of this in his presentation. Excuse me. So there are a couple of countries where this is sort of, I'll refer to it as a red line. And it's specifically listed in the export library that sort of do not pass go unless you've got a certificate that's signed and dated before the ship sails. And that the two that jump to mind are the European Union and secondly, Taiwan. We have like 0 to no success getting products or making, allowances, to get product in when there is the occurrence of the certificate is signed after the ship has sailed. The other one that comes to mind, and we haven't yet managed to come to agreement and work in language into the export library, but I think there's been communications through the USMEF newsletter and also on the USAPEAC newsletter side is South Africa. But in general, across the board, it is in your very best interest and to avoid any and all problems with all markets, we highly and increasingly highly recommend that you make every attempt in terms of your business processes and how you lay out those processes to account for the time needed to get a certificate signed, so that it does occur before the ship sails. Because increasingly we do get a lot of inquiries, and it seems to be a red flag, if you will, to foreign countries about, wait a second, how can this product have been certified, but yet I noticed the bill of lading says the ship sailed 3 days earlier. So it just cuts down on the questions, the problems, the delays you would have at import. And we do recognize that there are occasions where, and we saw some of this during COVID, staff are really strapped on the FSIS side, and it can be difficult in some remote locations to locate a veterinarian. These are issues, I guess I would say, on a broader scale that FSIS is aware of, and we are working. We have worked with our import or our implant personnel to make sure that they're aware. And I think for the countries I cited, they are fully aware. But again, we recommend you align your business practices, you communicate with your implant personnel to make sure they're wholly aware of the timelines you're operating under. Going back to, I think, Travis's statement, communication is key to try to do those things, according to the timeline. And then I guess I would say, as a broader issue, again, the agency is aware. We're kind of looking at, things we can do process-wise, and as we move into PHIS, that maybe would help streamline the processes, take some of the pressure off of our implant personnel, particularly veterinarians, which are sort of at a premium, and also for you on the industry side. But in the meantime, the recommendation is line up your business practices, do your very utmost best in every and all situations to make sure you get those certificates signed before the boat sails. And Travis, I don't know if you have anything to add, but that's sort of the FSIS perspective on that.
No, I think you covered that. I think you covered that very well. One question that I'll kind of tee up for you, Shannon, because I know this is something that you and I have worked on extensively over the years, is how does FSIS handle corrective actions for issues where, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit in your presentation, but for issues where potentially you have a residue violation and it's a false we want to say that it's maybe a false positive, or for example, the residue limit or the residue level comes back and it's, the MRL is 10, but the residue they came back with is 150, and it's just kind of outrageous numbers, and I think any logical person can look at it and say, okay, something went wrong here, but the country is saying, no, there's a violation and we need a corrective action. So kind of what's FSIS's process for handling a scenario like that?
Get myself off mute. So yeah, we have had a couple of cases. I think Travis, you and I've had a couple of corners of the world where this has popped up. I think Cheyenne and I had one in another corner of the world not too long ago. So we do have a couple of them. And again, I think I touched on it a little bit. We've had a few cases where this happens, where it's not a violation of our requirements. Maybe the levels that they're reporting seem a little bit off the wall. And again, I think what we encourage plants to do is still go back and go through that exercise, if you will, go through that reflective process of, okay, sort of setting aside the fact that, we think that ractopamine level, isn't science-based, or they use bad methodology, to arrive at that violation. Set that aside for a moment, go through the process of, okay, setting that aside, what can we learn from this notification, and what would be the steps that we would go back and look at, almost as a quality control type of exercise. And what did we discover that, well, maybe, is a little bit on point, maybe wasn't exactly on point, but what are those things that we can look at in our processes that may or may not have contributed to this, or that we can do and offer up in response to the foreign country. There are a few cases where I think we find, in some situations, it's almost a pro forma exercise to go through that. And that's, maybe not, the most pleasing thing to the ear, but there are some of these cases. And then there are also, and I guess this would sort of be behind the curtain for you all, is that when we identify those cases, we often include language from sort of the FSIS regulator perspective, why we're explaining what you all did at the plant level, what you identified when you went through that exercise. If you found something, or if you've tinkered with something to improve training, or maybe added a new check because it was simple and easy and it looks proactive to do, that we package that up. But it also it oftentimes is combined with FSIS making statements again that we don't agree with the science, or we want to remind you, that that's not consistent with our requirements and our negotiated agreements, but nonetheless, we're providing the following information. So again, there's not exactly a one size fits all, but again, we are looking, to the greatest extent possible to get the cooperation of the plants to provide us some sort of reflection on what maybe did or didn't go wrong, but what could be improved upon, so that we have something to give back to the foreign country in addition to what we're providing. I will also note that we have a few discrete cases, and I guess I would say most commonly maybe with the off condition ones, where they're a little bit inconclusive. Sometimes we've investigated, we've had a few cases I think where we've even given to our investigative authorities, and it's just inconclusive. Maybe the port of entry violation is, quite frankly, just too old. They've given it to us a year after, the product was there. We have no like-minded product left. We can't settle, so we've had a few very isolated cases where, quite frankly, we've exhausted. We went through the exercise on the regulatory side. You've gone through it on the plant side, and they're inconclusive. But ultimately, the goal, I think, for us is to try, frankly, to look like we did something, package up our best information, put our best foot forward, to maintain the confidence of the foreign country in our systems, that we do take food safety and their requirements seriously, and that you all at the plant level, are buying into that as well. So again, sometimes, like it or not, it's a little bit of a pro forma exercise. And again, these are all case-by-case situations, Travis. I think you know that as well as anyone. So sometimes we kind of have to find different and creative ways to thread the needle, but hopefully that gives a little bit of context of why this is important, to try to give the foreign country something to maintain confidence in our system and our approaches.
Yeah, and I know from the industry side, I mean, working with the establishments who've been put in this situation, it's I think you made this point during your presentation, is that there's a lot of frustration when you're out of a market for a period of time, when you've been dinged for a violation, when you feel like you did everything right, especially some of these false positive type scenarios. It's tough because you want to kind of push back on that and say, no, we didn't do anything wrong here. And it's can be kind of a tough pill to swallow, to say, we need compliance here just to get back in the market. But
right.
I mean, I can say through working with you and others at FSIS that if it is kind of just a pro forma exercise, the quicker you can just kind of provide what FSIS needs for its investigation and move it along, the quicker you're going to be back in the market, because oftentimes those arguments back to the foreign government are going to kind of fall on deaf ears if it's more of you're kind of trying to take a principled stance there. So
right.
Yeah, there's a balance between, the frustration and efficiency on this.
And the only other thing I'd add, is these sort of isolated, and I think these are the isolated situations, but I would say, this is an isolated kind of set of scenarios. Again, they sort of pop up case by case, but it is sort of that rare circumstances, I guess, where industry, and us as regulators are sort of like strange bedfellows. We're sort of in this together, particularly when we have these situations, where it doesn't make any sense or we don't agree, in trying to sort of figure out how to thread the needle, to overcome, maybe the bigger, problematic thinking or regulatory requirement that the foreign country has, but then also, ensure that the plant can continue to ship and maybe, some portion of their product still gets in. So again, it's a little bit of a delicate balance, and we always appreciate, again, I think those open lines of communication and the cooperative effort, to try to figure these things out. But there's not a one size fits all, and this is one of those, again, rare situations where I think, we're in it together, for better or for worse.
So we've just got a couple more minutes here, and I've got kind of one additional question, if there isn't any that comes from the panelists, or if Cheyenne has anything. But I know, especially for, the production establishments that are on here, oftentimes, and I'm speaking specifically to my region, because countries like Japan and Taiwan and Korea love to come audit. Sometimes we might find that there's kind of a relationship, if you will, between an establishment being selected for an audit and having some sort of past history of a nonconformance or a port of entry violation. So maybe you can talk to that a little bit, Shannon, and how that might get handled in the context of an audit, or even if there is seemingly a relationship between somebody who might have had a nonconformance in an export market and all of a sudden making the short list for an audit the next year.
Yeah, and I guess, maybe that's one of those things where, I don't know, depending on your standpoint, maybe you do blame FSIS, because I think to some degree that is one, I think that's a standard practice among, most all foreign inspection systems. But arguably, and where I say, well, maybe you could blame FSIS, is because that's sort of taking a page out of our playbook. To be quite honest, when we go audit foreign countries and we're making decisions about which plants to audit, there's a variety of factors that go into that equation. So volume, the nature of the risk of the product, any previous port of entry violations, any previous, audit history that's problematic. So at the end of the day, I guess, to be fair, that's how FSIS approaches sort of its decision-making process and some of the criteria we look at. And so, and quite frankly, I tell foreign countries, I can't really take issue with a foreign country saying, okay, you had a port of entry violation, you gave me a response, I happen to be coming for an audit, I'm going to put that plant, sort of in my top 3, because while I accepted your written corrective actions and I've continued to see product come in and we've performed port of entry inspection and we've had no problems, maybe in the 6 months that you gave us the corrective actions, I'm coming for an audit and I just kind of want to further verify, and I want to verify maybe some of the documentation you cited in your corrective actions, is in fact in existence. And, again, I haven't just been given a song and dance that FSIS and the establishment actually went through, the process as they said they did. So, documenting the changes and verifying, that training was completed and those kinds of things. And again, sort of taking a page from our playbook, and again, maybe it's an incentive to all the plants out there, is, just another reason maybe to keep things tight and clean, and make sure you don't have issues, not just with FSIS regulatory requirements, but even foreign country regulatory requirements, because if you do have those, you're potentially setting yourselves up, higher on the audit list. And again, that's blended in with other criteria. Some of you are never going to get out from underneath foreign audits just because, the volume of product you send or the nature of product. But nonetheless, it can, I think, in fairness, be a contributing factor to, the intensity or the frequency, you may find yourself in an audit situation. So hopefully, Travis, that addresses the question.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's very helpful. There's, we kind of typically get that question when we go out to the establishment and say, hey, you got selected for the Korea audit or the Taiwan audit or whatever it might be. And usually the first question is, well, what did we do? And so, yeah, that's, I mean, there's sometimes a little bit of a tie there, but yeah, I think that gives some good context around it.
It's not winning the golden ticket, that's for sure.
That's right. Well, if there are no other questions I see in the chat or the Q&A, once again, you'll get a survey when you exit out of this here, so please fill that out. I think it's like 5 questions. It's very short, but we always appreciate your feedback on this. Shannon, thank you for joining us today. It's very helpful and provides some good insight from the regulatory side, and appreciate your time this morning and this afternoon to make that happen. So, and thank you everybody for getting on today. Like I said, we'll come out sometime in the next month or so with details on what our next training program will be, but that'll be held sometime in June. And appreciate your time. So thanks, and everybody have a good rest of your day.
Great, thank you. Take care.